For more, let's bring in Margaret Brennan. Margaret, of course, is the moderator of Face the Nation and CBS News' chief foreign affairs correspondent. Margaret, so good to have you here. Finland says it wants to join NATO quickly. But what does that timeline look like? And what signal could it send to the Kremlin?
Well, Bob, what Vladimir Putin has done here is effectively turn a neutral country into an adversary, and he did it in astoundingly swift fashion by terrifying Europe. By going in and bombing Ukraine, he has convinced Finland, Sweden as well, to go and try to become NATO members. A Finnish official I spoke with this morning said the country, the prime minister and president, have decided to go ahead with this. A vote's expected. We could have an answer within the next 5 days as to what the process will be moving forward. But it is all but certain that Finland will go ahead with this application, and then it just becomes a matter of process, with Finland becoming the 31st country to be part of that NATO alliance of countries who swear to defend each other. An attack on one is an attack on all. And for Finland, they have an 800-mile border with Russia. So now Russia will indeed have NATO breathing down its neck. Vladimir Putin, came up with these claims that he was being threatened with NATO moving too close potentially to his country. That was one of his trumped-up reasons he used to justify the invasion of Ukraine. Well, because he invaded Ukraine, it triggered this fear that countries like Finland needed to find a way to defend themselves. One of the painful ironies here is that while this process will be very quick for Finland, in fact, I'm told could happen before the end of June, which is when we will see a big NATO summit happen in Spain. The irony here is that Ukraine, which would have loved a speedy process here to actually become a NATO member, will not be. And President Biden has said a lot of those problems stem from corruption and need for democratic reforms. But it is what happened to Ukraine that inspired these other countries like Finland and Sweden to ask to become full members.
Margaret, let's turn to another part of the world. President Biden is hosting leaders from 8 Asian nations Thursday at the White House, and China certainly is on the agenda for those discussions. What do you expect from this current summit?
The Biden administration would love nothing more than to put this conflict in Ukraine to bed and be able to turn towards Asia, where that long-term adversarial threat to the United States stems from, in the view of a majority of national security officials and even just across the aisle in Congress. It is so hard to find a bipartisan agreement on anything these days, and you do find it on China. This summit that's happening today and tomorrow here in Washington, it's the first time that all 45 years that all of these Southeast Asian nations have come here to Washington for this kind of meeting. I remember attending one years ago during the Obama administration out in California. And this is sort of the same players trying to do the same thing, which is to build up an alliance of Pacific countries to be a counterweight in some way to China. A lot of these countries, like Vietnam, like Cambodia, they're in China's backyard. They have to have relations with Beijing, but they have troubled history with China. They're not completely comfortable with some of the things that China requires when it comes to having transactions with them, for example. So this is the United States trying to demonstrate that in addition to facing conflicts on the Atlantic, it is a Pacific country. It is a Pacific leader and wants to knit together these Southeast Asian countries a little bit more. And this comes as President Biden is still preparing and still has not rolled out a China strategy in terms of foreign policy. We're still waiting on that, Bob, which is pretty incredible given how far into the administration we are and how important it is. But we'll be hearing more about that in the coming weeks, particularly as President Biden heads to those allied countries of Japan and South Korea by the end of the month.
Margaret, let's turn the globe one more time. There are a number of Americans detained in Iran. What's the latest on the U.S. government's efforts to try to negotiate their release?
This is extremely painful for the families. There are about 4 individuals who are Iranian-American dual citizens who, in the eyes of the regime in Tehran, are criminals. But according to U.S. intelligence, are just there on trumped-up attempts by the Iranian regime to extract some kind of concession, to try to use hostages as some kind of mechanism to get something from President Biden. You have their names on the screen there, and a lot of these individuals have been waiting for years. The Namazis, for example, have been there since the Obama administration. Imad Shargi, his family, I've interviewed them. They're in pain here because they know there is a deal on the president's desk ready to be made in terms of a prisoner swap, along with the release of frozen funds from bank accounts belonging to Iran that are frozen in South Korea right now, billions of dollars. This was the deal that was put together, but is being held up by the fact that the nuclear talks with Iran are completely stalled. And in this letter on Tuesday, the family of Imad Shargi wrote it to President Biden, appealed to his national security advisors to say, just on purely humanitarian grounds, can you strike this deal to bring our loved ones home? Don't allow for these individuals to be held hostage again to what is a complicated diplomatic agreement, but also one that could be politically painful for the president. We are going into the midterm election season. Anything that President Biden does in terms of striking any kind of deal with Iran could be something that is weaponized by his critics, or certainly weaponized against Democrats for releasing funds, for example, back to the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. But it's worth remembering that there are real people on the other end of this. And they are everyday people who feel very frustrated that they've become sort of tied up in these complicated negotiations about things they know nothing about, nuclear programs and the like, but simply are being held hostage because of their passports, because they are Americans. So that deal is really, the families are stuck in purgatory, to be quite clear on it.
We'll keep following this story and following your reporting. Margaret Brennan, thank you so much.
Thanks, Bob.